The other thing that my wife shared with me a couple of weeks ago that I didn't know about is that her dad, while owning, this black beauty supply store, got held up a number of times by African American people, and there was even
Those,
a time where
those
he
are the
got.
major events.
Was that?
Like those are the major events, things that in your narrative that those major events that happen that really truly do, put a magnifying glass on whatever the narrative was previously.
Yeah, no, that's right. And there was one time where he got, hit in the back of the head with the butt of a pistol while he was getting, held up. And I have another friend of mine that I've known since college days, where his parents owned a liquor shop in African American community in Chicago, and his father had received some sort of significant brain trauma because of a holdup that affected him for the rest of his life. And so those are those significant events where it's like, if that's your primary interface with an entire group of people, it's no wonder that there would be anger and that there would be resentment and fear and prejudice that kind of shapes that narrative.
I'm sorry. I was saying, especially when you don't, when there's no proximity and real community with other people, you know, like
Yeah.
if the only black people are the people that come to your store, then that's a recipe. And particularly when these major traumatic events that happen. But yeah, you were saying the LA riots.
Yeah, I mean, even with the LA riots, I was kind of reading up on it again because I was just going into high school in 1992, and so I remember it all in the news, but I wasn't particularly aware of all the details. But a lot of that was a response to police brutality with Rodney King, if you remember, in '92. But also, what you see as a result of the anger at that injustice, there was looting and destruction of what I read was $400 million of damage in to Korean-owned businesses, which is a staggering amount, right? It's an incredible thing. But even there, how those attitudes, I would imagine, for a lot of the African Americans there, if you walk into a store and you are racially profiled, right? You walk into a store and you do notice that the owners are kind of following you or keeping an extra eye on you. There's a presumption of guilt almost the moment that you walk in. Man, there's so much there that's just a powder keg waiting to be kind of lit. And so I look back on that as a real watermark moment where suddenly, at least for me in my own experience, racism wasn't just black white. Racism wasn't just white Asian. That there were issues in the black and Asian community, and even the churches that I grew up in. It was largely Korean American immigrants, but we had plenty of folks whose, for the most part, their parents met while the father was a GI in Korea, and the mother was Korean, and the GI might be white or black or whatever. But certainly the ones that were black and Asian interracial were never fully embraced, even in the Korean American church. Right, there was an otherness there that I think has created even more of those barriers. My wife has an uncle who's African American, so one of her aunts is married to an African American GI, and they've got three sons who are biracial. But even there, it's like, has there ever been a sense that the Korean American community embraced these folks as their own?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing. I mean, race being it's a social construct. So it's this construct that was created to give some people power and rights and privileges, and to deny other people power and rights and privileges. And since the inception of America, this racial experiment has really been the secret sauce of so much of the challenges. And you know what, Abe? One thing I was struggling with today, and I might not even say it well right now because I don't have a good way of explaining this. So I hope everybody bears with me on this. Like, so the Rodney King riots, right? All of the violence that happened was deplorable. Nothing was good about that or justifiable anyway. But you really do have that coming right off the heels of Rodney King, and really a black community that was feeling like targeted and invisible. And again, nothing at all, not trying to point the finger at white supremacy and say black people have no agency, they made us do it. I'm not at all saying that, because we do have agency in the decisions that we make. But man, it really is something that sometimes feels like a match was lit and people walk away from it. And the match truly, in many cases, if not, I mean, again, not trying to take away blame from different things. Like the lady that was beat up in Queens, um, you can't say, I mean, the guy who did it, you can't blame white supremacy on what he did. He did that. He made the decision, and there's a number of things that formed him to make that decision. So I'm not trying to blame things on white supremacy, but oftentimes I struggle with the conflict at large, in so much as so much of the historic tension really is fueled in whiteness, and also proximity to whiteness that makes everyone else want to run away from blackness as much as they could. So like talking to my boy Mike Lee, after my wife passed away 10 years ago, coming up in a couple of weeks, my boy Mike Lee he was truly like the guy who nursed me back to emotional health. We would hang out like 3 times a week, and we became very close friends, and we would just talk and have good conversations. And I would ask him like, "Yo, Mike, what would happen if you brought home a black woman?" And he was like, "Yeah, my parents would be pissed off." Like he's like, "They'd be really mad if I married a Japanese woman." He's Korean. He's like, "They'd be super pissed off if I married a black woman." And we just had good conversations about race then. So it really does feel like there has been this historic wanting to distance themselves from black people. So much so that this part right here is really tough. And I have people on Facebook who are friends. We're Facebook friends, not real friends, who really honestly, man, their attitude in this whole and everything is, well, they don't care about us. Like, why are we caring? Like, it's sad what happened, but they don't care about us. Why should we care about them? Like, they don't care about us at all. Like, let them deal with what they got to deal with, and we deal with what we got to deal with. And it's just a lot going on, bro. It's a lot for people to deal with and to process. Yeah.
Yeah, man. And when I think about even the LA riots, I think what can happen, and this certainly happened in my own kind of communities and my own family, is that you can look at the LA riots, and if you don't know the history of basically Black history in America, if you don't know the history of that oppression and the history that leads up to that moment, I think a lot of times in my own community growing up, there was a sense in which where it's like, look, we are here one generation. We figured out how to succeed.
Why don't you do it?
Clearly, there must be something wrong with Black people in general, because they're still stuck on X, Y, and Z, and they're out there, rioting or whatnot. But we just kind of quietly made our way, and we found our way. And so without understanding the hundreds of years of history that begins with enslavement, chattel slavery, there can be this presumption that just by looking at this particular moment, you can understand exactly what's going on. And there are narratives that are developed within communities I grew up in that says that is a narrative of superiority. We did it in one generation, and they've been in America for hundreds of years. And so I think there's a lot there when you're not aware of the history of your neighbor, or even the history of yourself. A lot of my own Asian American history is something that's kind of developing over time.
Yeah.
Comment about like marriage, that was definitely a narrative that I heard growing up. Like, look, we're a Christian family, so you have to marry someone who's a Christian for sure, and they can't be Black. Like, that was literally what I was told growing up. Got to be Christian, and definitely can't be Black. And when I would push back on that, there'd be a little bit of backtracking, but it would be like, well, because you don't want your kids to have that stigma either, so just don't marry a Black person. And this was like explicit. This was not something that people were trying to, dodge around. It was like straight up. And so I think there's a lot there, and a lot of those racial attitudes become very real because there's a lack of understanding of the history.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll own this right here. And again, this is embarrassing. One of my cousins, he's married to a Chinese woman, and she's first generation. And nobody ever explicitly said this is wrong, but we would all, I'm saying we to almost cover some of my shame. We would laugh at him and her before they came over, like to my grandmother's house on Christmas. And that's very embarrassing. I mean, because it really was like, bro, what are you doing? I mean, and she was very Chinese in her culture. I mean, it wasn't like she was American, and so there was a cultural barrier. So let's just say my parents are very happy I married a Black woman. I'll say that. Not that there was explicit messages to the contrary, but in my family, certainly the implicit messages, from uncles and everybody were like, we're definitely not in favor of that at all. I mean, at all. And you would be laugh. Yeah, people would laugh behind your back if you did it. It wouldn't be like you can't come over for dinner, but it definitely would not be encouraged. It definitely was not encouraged. That's for sure. And I think so much of it is really, I don't know. I mean, there's so much distance. And that's the thing about New York, bro. We're on top of each other, but there is not real relational proximity to other. And we live in these bubbles that really deny us the ability to form and to reform our narratives in a good way that's healthy, that brings the proximity that really does, it really does help us to get away from some of the media fed narratives in so many ways.
Yeah, man, for sure. And yeah, certainly in our communities, like I said before, like anybody who marries somebody outside of the Korean ethnic group was kind of looked down on. But if you marry someone white, it's like, okay, we could deal with that. Like, again, even somebody Japanese American, ooh, that's pushing the boundaries, but we could deal with that. But you marry someone black, and it's just becomes a very different kind of a conversation. And so, I look at my wife's family and actually realized just how progressive they were, in that he was a family that embraced a very diverse family, of interracial and interethnic marriages. And there was an embrace. I'm sure folks who weren't, 100% Korean felt on the margins, no doubt. But I think at the very least, there was an attempt to kind of offer an embrace. I think I saw a question earlier in the chat about how my father-in-law ended up in the business of black beauty supply stores. It's actually a fairly common thing for Korean Americans, Korean immigrants. So, some of the types of shops. My family was a little bit different. So my experience is unique. So this kind of speaks again to not any racial group is monolithic. My dad came here to do a PhD in economics, and he taught in business schools. And so almost all of my experience has been much more white collar and that sort of a thing. The more typical Korean immigrant experience is, somebody might come from Korea, might even have college degrees and have a decent, pretty strong education, but in America, none of that translates. And oftentimes they were basically looking to open up shops in places that were economically affordable for them to buy the real estate and get it going. And that the reality that it just meant it was oftentimes in economically depressed and oftentimes in majority African-American communities. And so the types of stores that they would pick up on were liquor stores, kind of corner convenience stores, fruit stands, and black beauty supply stores, and maybe like nail salons and that sort of thing, right? So there were kind of a handful of places where they were able to start shops and stores. But I do think this is one of those things where some of the economic forces that drives Korean immigrant communities into African-American neighborhoods, those kinds of things are the forces that are creating a context for conflict, right? So there's something about those economic forces that are actually going to begin to shape some of these racial narratives and experiences, which is what we're talking about, and our community experiences that I think are so significant.
This is a lot, man. I mean, we can go on and on with the narratives, the negative narratives, man. But like, what is the hope, bro? What's the plan?
Yeah, like what difference did Jesus make in all of this, even, right? Yeah. Like, what is that? And so, what I love about when you talk about the ways that we're formed, the narratives, the community, and the habits, man, the Bible has a new version of each one of those that are powerful, compelling, that there's no other reason to engage in the narrative and the community and the habits that the gospel offers unless Jesus is risen from the dead, And so you think about the narrative of a God who delights in difference, a God whose mission is to take all the difference in the world, and because of sin, all difference has become division, right? All difference has become hostility, but a God who delights in difference and is drawing them together even at the cost of his own son. That's a different narrative, right? That's a different narrative than we're better than black people because we figured this out in one generation. It's a different narrative than, we're going to look out for our own and forget about everybody else. It's a narrative of God is bringing people together. and to re-story ourselves as Christians, not in any way to minimize or downplay our ethnic differences by any stretch, but to say our ethnic differences are being gathered up into a beautiful story that only makes sense if Jesus is risen from the dead.
Yeah.
So restoring ourselves is a huge part of that. And this is the church when it comes to a new community. I think the church, it's a tragedy of the church that we are divided along all of the regular socioeconomic lines, that we reflect the social realities of our culture rather than shaping and forming the social realities of culture. As Dr. King put it, right, we're more like thermometers of our culture, reflecting our cultural world, not thermostats that are changing the temperature of our world. But the local church, as ordinary, as flawed, as challenging as it can be, that is God's ordained place of reconciliation.
Yeah.
So those are just a couple of thoughts that I have. What would you add to that?
Those are great. One of the things that I have been thinking about a lot is the power of confession. So over the summertime, when everything happened with George Floyd, and we had all these allies and stuff like that, who everybody was quick to make a statement, but I was like, man, I actually don't think statements are helpful. I think the first place we should always look is always the last place we want to go, which is inside. And to go to this age-old principle, if anyone, that we see all throughout Scripture, this spiritual practice of confession, and it's not trying to cover up how we were raised. It's also not experiencing shame, because to truly be freed from the penalties of our sins and to truly be reconciled with Christ, with our brothers and sisters, means that we can be honest about our past, our culture. We can critique our culture without self-loathing, and confession could be a part of our lives, instead of just pretending like I'm one of the people that never had any, who never had any anti-Asian ideologies or any other ideologies that are harmful or offensive, because it's embarrassing. Of course it is, but to really embrace confession as a practice, not when people are hurting, right? So right now, this is the moment that our Asian American Pacific Islander sisters and brothers are hurting. It's not a good time. It might not be the best time for me to center myself and start telling you why I feel bad. That ain't the time. In the moment of the crucible of pain, that is not the time to start the confession. But in appropriate times, when the heat is not that high, really confession being that practice to this confession is a huge practice, I think.
So I'm going to read a couple of scriptures, and then I'm going to ask a couple questions. The first one, Romans 15:2. Each of us should please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. 1 Corinthians 10:33. As I also try to please everyone in all I do, for I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many. 1 Corinthians 13:5. It is not rude, it is not self-seeking, is not easily angered, and keeps no account of wrong. 2 Corinthians 12:14. See, I am ready to come to you a third time, and I will not be a burden, because I am not seeking your possessions, but you. For children should not have to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. The last one is Philippians 2:21. For all the others look after their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. Think about those scriptures. They're all about how the Christian reacts to others. And as a result of that, if you are going to move into a community, and when I say move into the community, found your business, if you are going to do that and you're not a member of that community, what are some of the things you have to consider about being there? You're going to target this specific community. You're going to say, hey, I'm going over to sell meat to Jews, for example. One of the meats you should get rid of off of your list, right? And what meat would that be? Pork, yes. You have to, what'd you say, John? Okay, pork but not bacon. Yeah, bacon's excluded. Everyone eats bacon. There's bacon ice cream now, as a matter of fact, just in case you didn't know. But that's the thing. You have to consider who the people are. You just can't walk in there blindly and start selling to them. Now, if I am Jewish and I'm going to a shop where the owner knows nothing about me, I know this owner knows nothing about me. I'm going to do business. I'm going to enter into a contract with them. What should I do? Let's say that these people are, wow, I don't want to do that. I won't say Jewish again, but I don't want to use that analogy this time. Let's say that they're Bahamians. They're Bahamians, and you're going to, I don't know, enter into some contract with air conditioning. I can tell you, Bahamians don't use air conditioning much. They would like to use it, but the power bill is so high that they don't use it much. So his tolerance, her tolerance for heat is way up there. So and Paula's tolerance for heat is way down there. She likes it. If it were 70 in the house, she's happy. What I'm saying is you have to take into account who you're doing business with, who you're buying from, and you have to make that decision before you do it. We need to understand who people are, not stereotypical. I was shocked, honestly, to hear that the Korean business was that general stereotypical nail salon and beauty supply products. You can see them in all the popular movies, you know. A guy goes in to rob a store in South Central LA, the owner's always Asian. And the guy that's robbing the store is always black. That's just how the movies go because it's a stereotype. But our point is, as Christians, we have to look past those things, not be naive. But what are some of the things that we can do where we live? And I'm asking this, and these questions are going to come up over and over again. And it's not just going to be about business. Excuse me. Now that won't happen anymore. It's not just going to be about business, but it may be about a school teacher that's teaching my kids. It might be about a pastor that's going to pastor my church. What are some of those things that the Christian could consider to get him or herself acquainted with that pastor or that teacher? And I'm really asking for feedback here. Yes, Carol. Yes, Carol says that we have to get to know people, and that might include, you may have to invite them to your house. You may have to go to their house. You may have to eat some of their foods. You may have to do all kinds of different things that you're not used to doing. We have to break down some walls that are there, and the other person has to be reciprocal, because as Christians, it's what we're called to do. That's why I read those scriptures. It's what we're called to do. I say this because it kind of hurts when you say it. As Christians, we cannot look to the things that they've done wrong to us. Like 1 Corinthians 13 says, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, meaning love, it is not easily angered, and it keeps no records of wrongs. We can't do that as Christians. If we're going to do that, we've already failed. If we're going to say, back in 1823, this happened, and your great-great-grandpappy didn't do anything to stop it. Yeah, if you're coming from that point, we've already lost. Yes, Marilyn. Yes. Marilyn said that we should educate ourselves, and we have to remember. We don't want to disremember. We don't want to forget that these things happen, because it won't really allow you to know the person, right? I think that's a huge part of it. You just can't look at a person, as he said in the video, and say, hey, What's wrong with these people over here? They've been here for 400 years and they're still at the bottom. Look at their community. Look at our community. We just got here 50 years ago and look how much wealth we have. Yeah, there are circumstances that your community didn't have to deal with, right? That's a fair way of looking at it. And the reason why their community is depressed is because of a huge injustice that was done upon them. And it continues to get better, light years better, but not good enough yet. They don't have the opportunity still that you have. If a black person acts negatively in one situation, he robs you in your butcher shop, your meat shop, and then another black man comes in, I'm going to stretch it a little bit, and he robs you. When the third black man comes in, how do you feel? I'm going to tell you, this is just what I believe. So that was just a conversation of two men. Now this is a statement of one man. I think that you're going to feel like he's going to more than likely be of a negative impact to you, because that's human nature. But that's a feeling. The goal is to get out of our feelings. I went to middle school at Olson, and we used to catch snakes in the back there, Pirates World. And we learned, oh, look at that snake. That's one that bites and it's poisonous. Look at that snake. Oh, that's the one that we're going to make money off. We're going to catch a lot of them, take them to the pet store. And the guy pays $5 for every snake. You learn to recognize them by what they look like. I don't think that that's an oddity, but I think that we have to break past it because it's more than looks. But initially, you're going to get that sensation. Yes. So let me backtrack. The snake analogy was just about how people perceive things according to looks, right? So people perceive, if you have a red car, man, that car is really fast. If you have a white car, it's probably not that fast. What I'm saying is it was just a casual way of describing something. So please don't think that I'm calling black people snakes. I think that the whole point of racism is this. If you believe anything like that, that's what makes you a racist. And this is why I made this statement last week. There are very few classical racists, because racism means this. I believe that every person that's in this race is this way. I believe that every person in this race is that way. Racism is the idea that this race possesses more or less than that race. So when I say racism, every time I say it, it's like if I were to say patripassionism, right? It means that God suffered. The idea that we're going to hold to that system that God himself actually suffered. Any kind of ism is the idea. It's not about how you treat people. Racism has nothing to do with how you treat people. It has to do with this brain interprets people of this race to be like this and people of that race to be different than that intrinsically. It doesn't matter where you go to school, how much money you have, you are that way because you are of that race. And there are very few people that embrace that concept. That's what I mean. Al's question, when he asked the question about how are you going to feel when the third black person comes in, I was answering the question as this is how you're going to feel. Not that that's oughtness, that's how you should feel. But it is, for the most part, how you're going to feel for most people. And the reason why I know this is because I see people every day and I talk to them every day. And everyone, I'm going to be honest with you. If you tell me that you can't tell the differences between a negative person and a positive person in any sense, I wouldn't believe you. If I got out of my car and I threw a bottle on the floor and I staggered over to you, you're never going to have the same perception to me. If I got out of my car and I said, hey, good afternoon, it's good to meet you, you're going to already think that there's some negativity that's going to happen because I'm throwing out a beer bottle right on the floor. It's human nature. That's the isness. I'm not talking about the oughtness. It's human nature. All humans, I think, it's just my opinion, think that way. When we perceive something, we begin to react to it immediately. That's just the way it is. Paul and I were going to a movie, and there was a car coming around the corner. Couldn't even see it, but the sounds were coming out of the car. The lyrics that were coming out of the car it was the worst thing imaginable. I think that it should be against the law. Arrest him immediately. I said in my mind. But it had nothing to do with what color the driver of the car was. It just had to do with conduct. You know, and that's the thing that King talked about, Martin Luther King, is that people will know us according to the content of our character. It's going to be our character that will put on display before people even more than we do when we open up our mouths in most cases, because they can see us coming. And so with regard to racism, you know, we're having this class understanding racism, and I think not so much a classical sense, but racism as we use the word today. I'm being treated poorly or better because of the way the system is set up in our current period. So we want, as Christians, to reach out to people, old people, young people, and have them know that we love all people, and we want to treat all people not fairly but greatly. We want to treat you with love so that you can prosper in this world. That's the goal, is for each man to prosper, because we're looking on your situation and we're trying to help that situation. Father, we thank you for the love that you've given us, Lord, that we would come to a class like this, that we would take the chance on speaking out, Lord, and risking being criticized for our thoughts. But we know that all the things that you've instructed us to do, Lord, you've done it out of your love. You've done it out of your wisdom for mankind and how we should act towards one another. Not the way that we do it every day, but the way that we should. We ask you that you would sanctify our hearts, Lord, that we would deal justly and righteously with each man and woman, boy and girl in this world, Lord, because we are, in fact, all possessors of your image. Be with us now, Lord, and create new opportunities to do this. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen.